to get 400 plus, which I kind of like, that I'm happy with, that are in focus enough to be usable. That's the other debate with street photography, as to what's acceptable in terms of focus. And like with a lot of photography, you're not always looking for perfection. You're not looking for perfect exposure, perfect composition, perfect focus. You're looking for stories, and on the street we're telling stories. So it took me a long time to learn that sometimes a slightly blurred moving target, if it's interesting, is better than a not interesting picture that's perfectly sharp and all the other things that come into an exposure. So I try not to be too hard on myself in terms of street photography. If it's miles out of focus and looks a bit crap, then I won't use it. But if the story's there, even though the person may be moving a bit blurred, or it's focused on the hands, not their face, all those other things, I tend to not get myself in too much of a state about, because the nature of the beast, without jumping out, stopping and saying to somebody, stand there for a second, I'll take your spontaneous photograph. Without doing that, then you there's a lot of things that are out of your control. So pointing the camera in the general direction, hoping you get a shot, taking a burst of 3 or 4 shots, one of them will be somewhere near. It kind of pretty much works for me. So that's my approach, but with some control. And then, because I'm shooting in RAW, I can get into Photoshop and I can have a look at them and bring out the detail and try to make it how I saw it and how I felt it at the time. And that's a little different. I think I must see the world in contrast. Everything's heavily contrasted for me, and each to their own. People all have the different tastes, but I think I see the world quite contrasty. So when I look at my pictures, I'm always trying to make them how I felt them at the time, so they always end up being a little contrasting. You'll see as we go through this edit how I get to that point. So I'll pick one. We'll start with the personals. This guy, I just saw him and it was really interesting. This is behind the Pantheon in the centre of Rome, and like with all major cities, there's lots of homeless, and there's lots of deprivation, and you kind of got around the front, you've got thousands of people queuing to go and see this fabulous building, which is strangely enough, just a slight aside, when you get in it, it's another one of those places that's maybe could have been, possibly, we think, which tells me we don't know anything about it really. But it's interesting to see all those thousands of holidaymakers trying to get in there, and just round the back there's a guy collecting cardboard to sleep on, and I didn't actually realise that until I came to edit it. So I'll open it up in Photoshop and we'll have a look in RAW and see what I got straight off the camera. So you can see straight off the camera, that's not too bad. ISO 200, f4.5. Oh, this one 1/250th of a second, so I must have adjusted it at this point for some reason. Can't remember why, but I must have. And that's not too bad when you look at it. And focus wise, it's pretty acceptable, I think, really, when you consider he's moving, I'm moving. She's a little distracting in the background, but is actually almost nicely framed. I'll probably crop that a little bit lower, but as a general exposure, that's not too bad. Not too bad at all. But there are a couple of little clipped highlights I want to bring back, and I think I'd like to see a little bit more of his character. So what I'm going to do with that is, first thing I'm going to do is actually look at the colour, because it was very warm and the camera was set to daylight. But as I've said in previous videos, that cameras light all the time. In fact, the colour balance, white balance on most cameras is crap, and it certainly rarely marries up with what you see in the histogram. So if we jump to auto, takes all that red off, but that building there, that is red brick, so I know instinctively, that's not quite right. If I put it onto daylight, which is what I shot, so I shot auto, as shot that was set to daylight. If we put it actually on daylight, it just goes a little warmer. You can see that. As shot, that's set to Canon daylight, and then daylight in Photoshop. Vastly different. And if we look at the histogram, it's added loads of red in there. But I do know from memory that brick building behind him is quite red. You can see a little bit in the shirt. awful using the colour dropper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trust my memory, and I'm going to go with daylight as I shot it, because I think with the Adobe Daylight, it's just pumping too much red in, particularly into his shirt. So I'm going to leave that as was. Next time we look at exposure, and I said I want to get rid of some of the highlights. I think there's a couple of highlights here just are annoying me a little bit. So I'm just going to drag maybe 20 or 30% off there, and you can see that. You can see the highlights dropped a little bit. But conversely, I want to see more detail in his face. I want to see more of the guy. So if I just pump up the shadows a little, which gives me a little bit of highlight too, you can see if I just click before and after, the detail, particularly the shadows. And because I like to slightly underexpose and then bring it back at the next stage, I'm just going to knock 25% off the exposure there, just to make sure I've got plenty of room to play with highlights. Okay, there's lots of highlights there. I'm going to OK that now. So that's the first process I always do. You'll have seen that in the other videos I do. Check the raw file, see where I feel it fits. So now we've got him into into Photoshop, and again I'm going to look at my histogram. Got a little bit of missing exposure here to the right, which is great because it means I can feather the highlights back in where I want. So if I open up the levels and just pop in some highlights into there, just pops, gives it a little pop. And although Photoshop's telling me that I'm already pinching shadows, I'm going to pinch a little more because, like I said to you earlier, I like contrast. So if I flick between the two, see the little punch. Now I know some of you are saying, but Lance, you took that off in the raw file. I did, and that's because I like to feather it at this stage. So now I've done that, what I can do is, if this will behave, using the paintbrush tool and just dropping the opacity on it a little bit to 50%, I can brush in a bit more of the detail back into there, so it's not quite so blown, because that was really the only place where we've got a little bit of blown highlight. And yes, I know I'm being really finicky, but if this was going to go to print, those highlights would just be banks of white, and that's not what we want, is it? So just quickly brushing back in his shirt detail, which is quite nice. And I'm also gonna just, I'm probably gonna crop that out, but I'm gonna take it out anyway. Let's have a look. So conversion, edit, conversion, edit. You can see the color shift in using levels and brushing out those highlights. We've just made that slight alteration, but we've still got blue and red in the same place. Not quite got so much yellow now, which will have been in the highlights. So quite happy with that. We can see his face, see his expression. I know, yes, he's a little bit soft, I know that. So quite happy with that. What do I want to do now? Well, I'm not going to do any more work on that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to Control Shift and E, and then I'm going to file save as a copy, save as a JPEG copy, size 12. So if I make a mistake from now, I've got a copy of that. So I said to you before, she's a bit distracting, isn't she? So before I go any further, I'm just going to have a play around with taking her out of the picture just to see how it looks without her. So I'm going to edit content aware fill. Let's see how fill deals with her. Oh, she's gone. Like so. So just quickly, yeah, Is it a true street photo? I think so. I've just taken a distraction out. It's no different to taking out a red blob or something. She doesn't really add to the scene. She's not a lot of people, a lot of posh people sitting there with loads of money with a Tesla. There's no juxtaposition there. She's just a young holidaymaker that just happened to get in shot. So I wanted to take her out. If there was a juxtaposition there, I would have left her in. So let's just have a look how that works. Alright, so I'm gonna do it this way. I'm gonna clone out the pipes or the railings, whatever it is, he says. Just like so. Just to tidy that up a little bit. There we go. So she's gone. Now, as I'm looking at that, is there anything else there that's distracting? Got rid of the distracted girl. That highlight there, as nice as it is totally distracting to me. So again, I'm just going to make a mess of getting rid of it like that. So you can see people won't be looking at that now. So that's the kind of distractions out of the way. What I'm not keen on though is all this space up here. Now if I was going to use this as an advert and it needed some text on it, I'd probably leave it, but I'm not. So I'm going to crop it. I'm going to centralize it more so we just see him, not so much what's around him. So like I always say, when you crop him, make sure you crop him for purpose. Original size, original ratio. Don't want to change that. Just going to centralize him just until he's centered, which is probably about there. So I'm probably getting rid of about 15 or 20% of the picture. And he's now centralized quite nicely in the frame. Looks quite good. I've not done anything else other than get rid of those bits. I haven't done anything to him. I'm not going to sharpen him up or any of that stuff because remember, I've got moving target, guest settings on camera. I'm moving. The fact that there's only that little bit of motion blur there, I think probably the focus kind of hit around here somewhere, around his chest. So that my focusing wasn't miles off. It's just that slight bit of motion blur that's kind of killed it. But it's I can live with that. So again, I'm going to flatten the layers. I'm going to save that over our last copy. In fact, I'm going to call this one copy 2 because we'll have a look at the two side by side. The first edit I did in that one. See how we think. And let's drag it back up and see. So that was the first one. That was the second one. Slightly distracting background, non-distracting. Not centered, lots of spare wall space. Not much use to anybody. Centered, less wall space. You can still tell where he is if you knew where that was. So that's it for me for that picture. So it's taken me 10 minutes to talk you through what I've done, but if that's me editing it, it's 30 seconds, maybe less, to do that. And I've got a colour copy. And what I always do with my street photos is make a black and white copy just to see how it might look in black and white. So we'll do that now. Same process for me as always with black and white. Using the layers palette, choosing a solid colour, making sure it's a negative colour, so anything that's on the grayscale, grey, white or black. Click OK, change the blending mode to colour. Instant black and white. I want more punch, I want more highlights, more shadows. So I do that by loading in the RGB channel, pressing Control. You'll see that little thing appear above the cursor. Click on RGB. Then we're going into curves in here. Make sure your curves are set up for pigment ink. There's a video of mine out there shows you how to do that if you're not sure. Click in the center. When interested in the output, I'm going to give it 15% highlights, and now I'm going to copy that, invert it, and now this time I go back the other way, and all this does is affect the shadows. So minus 5% shadows. So highlights for highlights only affects highlights. Shadows inverted, only affects shadows. Yep, and that's a much punchier, much more black and white. We're pinching on the edge of detail here, so again I'm going to click onto my highlights layer, click into the mask with the paintbrush tool on 50%. I'm just going to brush back in some highlights there because I don't want them to be blown out if I make a print. Just going to brush them back in. It's not so bad. Maybe that back wall as well, that's a little hot, but other than that, good to go. Shadows are looking good. Histogram slightly underexposed up here where I've taken off the highlights, but I'm not worried about that. File, save as copy, copy to M for mono, like so. I'm going to close that down, and then we'll just have a look at these two. Copy to, like that. Oops, what did I do there? 8 windows. And the mono, pop them both up side by side, and you can see quite nice black and white and colour version of the same picture. Detail in his face, you can see his expression. His clothes aren't overexposed. Colour's good on the left. The mono's great. The only way I'll ever make a mono. Learned part of that from Guy Gowan. I've mentioned him in the videos. And that's it. So I'm going to move on to the next picture.